January 13th, 1942. Dawn broke cold and grey over the Atlantic waters off Cape Cod, Massachusetts. Captain Reinhard Hardigan, commanding U-boat 123, studied the horizon through his periscope. The veteran German submariner couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. Massive cargo ships and tankers plodded along the American coastline, completely unescorted, their running lights blazing in the darkness as if there were no war at all. Some were so close to shore that Hardigan could see automobile headlights on the coastal roads. The United States had been at war for just over a month, but you wouldn't know it from the easy pickings steaming past his torpedo tubes. That morning, Hardigan fired on the British freighter Cyclops, sending it to the bottom with 181 souls aboard. It was the opening shot of Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat, Germany's campaign to bring the U-boat war to America's doorstep. What followed would be remembered as the Second Happy Time by German submariners, a period of slaughter so one-sided that U-boat captains later called it the American shooting season. In the first 7 months of 1942, German submarines would sink over 233 ships in the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico, destroying 22% of the Allied tanker fleet and killing more than 5,000 seamen and passengers. More people died in these waters than at Pearl Harbor, yet most Americans had no idea the carnage was happening just miles from their beaches. The US Navy was caught completely unprepared. Admiral Ernest King, commanding the Atlantic Fleet, had exactly 7 Coast Guard cutters, 4 converted yachts, 3 patrol boats from 1919, 2 gunboats dating back to 1905, and 4 wooden submarine chasers to defend the entire eastern seaboard from Maine to Florida. About 100 aircraft were available, but these were short-range trainers unsuited for combat. The Navy didn't even have enough vessels to organise proper convoy escorts, the proven tactic that had protected shipping in World War I. Ships sailed independently, silhouetted against the bright lights of coastal cities that refused to implement blackouts, making them perfect targets for surfaced U-boats operating in what the Germans mockingly called the American turkey shoot. Admiral Karl Dönitz, mastermind of the U-boat campaign, had correctly calculated that American defences were fragmentary and disorganised. His submarines operated almost with impunity through the spring and summer of 1942. In February alone, U-boats sank 34 Allied merchant ships and a warship between Nova Scotia and Venezuela. The slaughter peaked in June with 824,000 gross tons of shipping sent to the bottom. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, watching precious war supplies disappear beneath the waves, called it a terrible massacre. The US Navy needed a solution, and they needed it fast. They turned to one of the most unlikely weapons of war ever deployed, massive bags of helium-filled gas that would patrol America's coasts for the remainder of the conflict. These were the US Navy Blimps, and they would write one of the most remarkable and least-known chapters in the Battle of the Atlantic. The story of how America came to deploy blimps against submarines begins decades earlier, with lessons learned in the First World War. In 1918, German U-boats had ventured into American waters, sinking merchant ships and cutting undersea communications cables with relative ease. The U-boat U-151 alone sank 20 ships totaling over 50,000 tons, demonstrating the vulnerability of coastal shipping. The Navy had responded by deploying non-rigid airships, essentially balloons with attached gondolas and engines, for coastal patrol. These primitive blimps proved valuable for spotting surfaced submarines, which in that era needed to surface frequently to recharge batteries and navigate. After World War I ended, the Navy continued limited airship development, but the program was overshadowed by the glamorous rigid airships, the giant zeppelins that captured public imagination. The Navy operated 4 of these massive vessels, the Shenandoah, Los Angeles, Akron, and Macon. But rigid airships proved to be death traps. The Shenandoah broke apart in a thunderstorm in 1925, killing 14 crew members. The Akron crashed into the Atlantic in 1933, drowning 73 men. The Macon went down in 1935 off California's coast. These disasters nearly killed the Navy's entire lighter-than-air program, but a small group of advocates kept the faith in smaller, non-rigid blimps. Unlike the giant rigid airships with their complex internal frameworks, non-rigid blimps were essentially just gas envelopes with control cars hanging underneath. They were cheaper to build, easier to operate, and far safer. When properly handled, a blimp could survive punctures and even gunfire without catastrophic failure. Most importantly, they had characteristics that made them nearly perfect for anti-submarine warfare. By 1937, with war clouds gathering over Europe, the Navy began seriously reconsidering blimps for coastal defence. They ordered the K-2 from the Goodyear Aircraft Company in Akron, Ohio. The K-2 would become the prototype for the most successful military airship class ever built. When the K-2 first flew on December 6, 1938, it represented a quantum leap over previous blimp designs. The envelope held 404,000 cubic feet of non-flammable helium, making it the largest non-rigid airship the Navy had ever operated. It measured roughly 250 feet in length and 60 feet in diameter, a bulbous silver whale floating improbably through the sky. 2 Pratt & Whitney Wasp radial engines, each producing 425 horsepower, hung on outriggers from the sides of a 40-foot-long control car suspended beneath the envelope. The control car, or gondola, was where the magic happened. Unlike the cramped cockpits of fighter planes or even the tight quarters of bombers, the K-ship's control car was remarkably spacious. It had to be, because these airships would fly patrols lasting 20 to 40 hours, sometimes longer. The control car contained bunks for the crew to rest in shifts, cooking facilities, lockers, and remarkably for aircraft of that era, an actual bathroom. For men who would spend days aloft, this wasn't luxury, it was necessity. The crew of a K-ship numbered 10 men, a small floating community. The command pilot sat up front with an unobstructed view through large windows. 2 co-pilots, a navigator who also served as a pilot, an airship rigger responsible for the envelope and its pressure, an ordnance man to manage weapons, 2 mechanics to tend the engines, and 2 radio men to handle communications and operate detection equipment. Each man had specialised training that took months to master. The top speed of a K-ship was modest, about 78 miles per hour flat out, with a cruising speed of around 57 miles per hour. To pilots accustomed to the screaming velocities of fighter planes, this seemed laughably slow. But for anti-submarine warfare, this speed was nearly perfect. German U-boats, when surfaced, could manage only about 18 miles per hour. When submerged, they crawled along at perhaps 8 miles per hour, and even that pace would drain their batteries in hours. A blimp was more than fast enough to catch any submarine, yet slow enough to pace a convoy of heavily laden merchant ships for hours on end. The real genius of the blimp for submarine hunting lay in its other characteristics. Unlike a patrol plane that had to keep moving or fall from the sky, a blimp could hover motionless over a contact, maintaining observation indefinitely. It could fly as low as 100 feet above the waves, giving the crew exceptional visibility for spotting periscopes, oil slicks, or even the shadows of submerged submarines in shallow water. The engines were quiet enough that crews on ships below could hear conversation from the blimp's gondola. Most remarkably, a blimp could stay aloft for extraordinary lengths of time. While patrol planes might manage 8 to 12 hours before needing to refuel, a K-ship could fly for 40 hours straight, covering ranges up to 2,000 miles. This endurance meant that a blimp could escort a convoy from port to the limits of its operational range and back without refueling, providing continuous protection that no fixed-wing aircraft could match. When Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II on December 7, 1941, the Navy possessed exactly 10 non-rigid airships, a pathetically small force. 6 were K-class ships built between 1938 and 1941. 4 were older types, barely suitable for training. The single operational base for these airships was Naval Air Station Lakehurst in New Jersey, the same field where the Hindenburg had burned in 1937. It was nowhere near enough. As German U-boats began their rampage along the American coast in January 1942, Navy planners scrambled to expand the airship program. They faced enormous challenges. Building blimps wasn't like building conventional aircraft. The massive envelopes required specialized fabrics and enormous hangars for construction and maintenance. Helium, the lifting gas, was in limited supply and jealously guarded. Training crews took time. Establishing bases required constructing hangars that could house airships the size of office buildings. But the Navy had no choice. Ships were sinking at an unsustainable rate. In February 1942, with U-boats operating freely in American waters, the Navy stood up its first wartime blimp patrol squadron, ZP-12, at Lakehurst with just 4 K-class airships. On the west coast, where Japanese submarine attacks were feared, ZP-32 was formed at Naval Air Station Moffett Field in California with 2 ancient TC-class blimps from the Army and 2 L-class ships originally designed as advertising blimps. These squadrons began flying patrols immediately, despite their inadequate numbers and untested tactics. The early patrols were learning experiences, sometimes painfully so. Blimps were challenging to handle, especially in the unpredictable weather of the North Atlantic. Sudden wind shifts could slam an airship into the ground. Thunderstorms could rip envelopes apart. Landing and mooring required large ground crews, sometimes 40 men or more, to wrestle the massive craft to the ground and secure them to mooring masts. Training accidents were frequent. The 56th Fighter Group, training with P-47 fighters, lost more pilots to training accidents than they would to enemy action in their first months. The blimp squadrons weren't much better. Pilots had to learn to manage the envelope's pressure as altitude changed, master the peculiar handling characteristics of an aircraft that flew more like a boat than a plane, and develop tactics for a mission no one had ever really practiced before. But gradually, through trial and painful error, the airship crews figured out how to hunt submarines. The key was patience and the blimp's unique capabilities. A K-ship on patrol would cruise at 1,000 to 2,000 feet altitude, high enough for the crew to have a commanding view of the ocean, but low enough to spot surface details. The slow speed that seemed like a disadvantage became an asset, allowing spotters time to carefully scan every square mile of ocean for the telltale signs of submarine activity. By mid-1942, K-ships were being equipped with technology that transformed them from flying observation posts into true submarine hunters. ASG radar, with a detection range of 90 miles, could spot surfaced U-boats in darkness or bad weather. Magnetic anomaly, detection equipment, MAD, could sense the distortion in Earth's magnetic field caused by a submarine's steel hull, allowing detection of submerged boats in shallow water. Sonobuoys could be dropped to listen for submarine propeller sounds. For offensive capability, K-ships carried 4 Mk-47 depth charges, each weighing 350 pounds, 2 in an internal bomb bay and 2 on external racks. A 50 caliber Browning machine gun was mounted in the forward part of the control car, primarily for suppressive fire against surfaced U-boats that chose to fight rather than dive. The depth charges weren't designed to sink submarines directly, that would prove nearly impossible, but they could damage boats, force them to the surface, and most importantly keep them submerged and unable to attack convoys. The real power of the blimp lay not in its weapons, but in its presence. As Goodyear ramped up production through 1942 and 1943, more squadrons were formed and deployed. By late 1942, blimps were stationed not just in Lakehurst and Moffett Field, but in new bases being frantically constructed along both coasts. In the east, bases sprouted at Weeksville, North Carolina, Glencoe, Georgia, and Richmond, Florida. In the Gulf, stations were established at Houma, Louisiana, and Hitchcock, Texas. Blimps deployed to Caribbean stations in Jamaica, Trinidad, Guantanamo Bay, and eventually down the coast of South America to Brazil. On the west coast, new stations opened at Tillamook, Oregon, Santa Ana, California, and smaller facilities dotting the coastline. To build these stations quickly, the Navy designed standardized wooden hangars, enormous timber cathedral structures 1,075 feet long, 297 feet wide, and 171 feet high. These were among the largest wooden structures ever built, and they went up with remarkable speed. The one at Tillamook was completed in just 27 days. The convoy system was formalized in May 1942, and blimps became integral to its operation. A typical convoy escort mission would begin before dawn. The K-ship crew would arrive at the base, conduct pre-flight checks of the envelope, engines and equipment, and lift off as the sun rose. They would rendezvous with their assigned convoy, typically 20 to 50 merchant ships plodding along at 10 to 12 knots, escorted by a handful of destroyers or corvettes. The blimp would position itself ahead of the convoy, sweeping the projected path for submarines. Flying a zigzag pattern, the airship would cover a swath of ocean miles wide, with radar probing even further into the distance. The presence of the blimp changed the tactical equation for U-boats completely. German submarine doctrine called for U-boats to travel on the surface whenever possible, both to make better speed and to conserve battery power. Submerged, a U-boat was nearly blind, its periscope providing only a narrow field of view and dangerously slow. But a blimp overhead made surface travel suicidal. Even if the blimp itself couldn't sink the submarine, it could direct destroyers or patrol planes to the contact in minutes. Faced with airship coverage, U-boat captains had no good options. They could stay submerged, burning precious battery power while the convoy steamed safely past. They could try to run on the surface, only to be spotted immediately and depth-charged, or they could abandon the attack entirely and hunt elsewhere. Most chose the latter. This was the secret to the blimp's success. Throughout the war, US Navy blimps flew approximately 37,000 combat patrols. They escorted roughly 89,000 convoy ships through waters patrolled by German U-boats and, in the Pacific, Japanese submarines. And of all those thousands of ships escorted by blimps, only one, the tanker Persephone, was sunk by enemy action while under airship protection. Blimp advocates would trumpet this statistic for decades. Not one ship was lost under blimp escort, they would say. It became the proud boast of the airship service. But the full story is more complex. Those convoys were also escorted by surface ships, and some had patrol planes providing additional coverage. It's impossible to separate how much of the success was due specifically to the blimps versus the overall convoy system. What is clear is that blimps were an effective deterrent. U-boats avoided areas with airship coverage whenever possible. German submariners were under standing orders to crash dive immediately upon sighting any aircraft. The mere possibility that a blimp might be overhead made U-boats operate more cautiously, reducing their effectiveness. But blimps weren't invulnerable, and U-boats weren't always willing to run. The night of July 18, 1943, would prove that point in spectacular and tragic fashion. K-74 was on patrol over the Florida Straits, escorting a tanker and a freighter through waters known to be infested with U-boats. The airship was commanded by Lieutenant Nelson Grills, a competent pilot with months of experience but no combat encounters. At about 11:00 p.m., the K-74's radar picked up a contact, a surface submarine. Grills brought his airship in to investigate. Through the darkness, the crew made out the unmistakable silhouette of a U-boat running on the surface. It was U-134, commanded by Hans-Gunther Brosen, making a transit through the straits. Navy doctrine was clear. Airships were not to directly engage surface submarines. They were to maintain distance, report the contact, and guide in surface ships or patrol planes for the attack. Blimps were too vulnerable, their envelopes too easily punctured to risk in direct combat. But Grills saw the submarine heading toward his convoy. The nearest destroyer, USS Dahlgren, was miles away. The surface ships would get there eventually, but by then the U-boat might have torpedoed and sunk both merchant vessels. Grills made a command decision: he would attack. The K-74 approached U-134 from astern, hoping to drop its depth charges before the submarine could react. But someone aboard the U-boat spotted the approaching airship. Searchlights stabbed upward, pinning the K-74 in their beams. Then the U-boat's anti-aircraft guns opened fire. U-134 mounted two 20mm automatic cannons and multiple machine guns for air defense. At point-blank range, with the blimp illuminated and moving slowly, the German gunners couldn't miss. Tracer fire raked the K-74's envelope. The crew in the control car fired back with their .50 caliber machine gun and personal weapons, Tommy guns and M1911 pistols, a futile gesture against an armoured submarine. Grills tried to drop the K-74's depth charges, but accounts differ on whether they released or not. Some sources claim they malfunctioned. Others suggest at least one exploded close enough to damage the submarine's hull. Either way, the K-74 was doomed. The 20mm shells tore through the envelope, causing catastrophic helium loss. One engine was knocked out. The control car took hits, wounding one crewman. The airship lost buoyancy rapidly and plunged toward the ocean. Grills had just enough control to ditch rather than crash. The K-74 hit the water hard but intact. The crew scrambled out as the deflating envelope settled around them. They inflated life rafts and watched U-134 withdraw into the darkness. The submarine was damaged, unable to dive, but Brosen decided to break off and make repairs rather than finish off the downed airship crew. For 8 hours, the 10 men of K-74 floated in the dark waters of the Florida Straits, waiting for rescue. Just before dawn, when the destroyer Dahlgren and rescue aircraft were finally closing in, tragedy struck. Aviation machinist's mate, second-class Isidor Stessel, already wounded from the battle, was attacked by a shark. He disappeared beneath the waves before his crewmates could pull him to safety. The other 9 men were rescued. Stessel became the only US Navy airship crewman killed by enemy action in World War II. U-104 limped away from the battle, unable to submerge but still seaworthy. Brosnan reported to headquarters that he had shot down an American airship, a rare victory for the U-boat service, but the damage was more serious than initially thought. U-134 remained on patrol for another month, but it couldn't dive deeper than periscope depth. On August 24, 1943, a British Wellington bomber from No. 179 Squadron caught U-134 surfaced off the coast of Spain. Unable to crash dive, the submarine fought back with its remaining anti-aircraft guns. It wasn't enough. The Wellington's depth charges found their mark. U-134 went to the bottom with all 48 crew members. K-74's attack contributed to that kill, even though the airship was lost in the attempt, but it also vindicated Navy doctrine. Blimps simply couldn't survive direct combat with surface submarines. Their value lay in detection and deterrence, not direct attack. After the loss of K-74, airship crews were reminded repeatedly to maintain distance from surfaced U-boats and call in the professionals with guns and depth charges. The incident did spur discussions about improving blimp armament. Experiments were conducted mounting Browning automatic rifles in the control cars, giving crews better firepower than a single .50 caliber machine gun. Photos from October 1943 show a K-ship with an experimental bar mount, but the idea was never implemented fleet-wide. The Navy concluded it was better to keep blimps out of gunfights entirely. By 1944, with Allied shipping losses dropping dramatically thanks to improved convoy tactics, better radar, more escort ships, and the breaking of German codes, blimps transitioned to new roles. 6 K-ships made the first transatlantic crossing by non-rigid airships in June 1944, flying from South Weymouth, Massachusetts, via Newfoundland and the Azores to French Morocco. This wasn't just a publicity stunt. The blimps of Airship Patrol Squadron ZP-14 were deploying to the Mediterranean for a critical mission. The Strait of Gibraltar, only 8 miles wide at its narrowest point, was the choke point between the Atlantic and Mediterranean. German U-boats attempting to transit the strait to support operations in the Mediterranean had to pass through relatively shallow water, where magnetic anomaly detection equipment worked best. The problem was that MAD required flying low and slow, dangerous for conventional patrol planes at night. Blimps were the perfect solution. ZP-14's K-ships established a round-the-clock MAD barrier across the strait. Consolidated PBY Catalina flying boats patrolled by day. Blimps took over at night, hovering low over the dark waters with their MAD equipment sweeping for the magnetic signatures of submerged U-boats. The results were immediate and decisive. From June 1944 through the end of the war, no German submarine successfully transited the Gibraltar Strait. ZP-14 completely denied its use to the Axis. The blimps also conducted mine-spotting operations, searching Mediterranean ports for mines laid by submarines and aircraft. Their slow speed and excellent visibility made them superb mine hunters. K-ships spotted and marked mines for disposal teams, opening ports that had been closed by mining. In early 1945, ZP-14 blimps participated in one of the most prestigious escort missions of the war. When President Franklin Roosevelt and Prime Minister Winston Churchill travelled to the Yalta Conference to meet with Joseph Stalin, part of their journey included a convoy through the Mediterranean. K-ships provided air cover, ensuring the safety of 2 of the 3 most powerful men in the world. Back in the Atlantic, blimps continued their convoy escort missions until the war's end. The last significant contribution came in early May 1945, just days before Germany surrendered. U-858, under the command of Kapitänleutnant Thierlo Bode, surfaced off Cape May, New Jersey on May 10th. Germany had surrendered on May 8th, but U-858 had been at sea and unable to receive orders. The submarine's crew decided to surrender to American forces. A K-ship from ZP-12 was dispatched to help escort the surrendering U-boat into port, a fitting bookend to the airship's war against submarines. Another U-boat, U-881, was less cooperative. Detected off Newfoundland on May 6th, 2 days before Germany's surrender, U-881 attempted to break through Allied lines to escape to Norway. US Navy blimps located the submarine and, directed destroyers to the contact. The destroyer Farragut and frigate Natchez attacked with depth charges and Hedgehog projectiles. U-8L-81 was sunk with all hands, one of the last U-boats destroyed in the Atlantic. Throughout the war, US Navy blimps accumulated staggering statistics. Over 5.5 million hours flown, nearly 90,000 ships escorted in convoys, 3 million square miles of ocean patrolled, and all of this was accomplished with the loss of exactly one airship to enemy action, K-74. The numbers seem almost too good to be true, and skeptics have questioned whether blimps were actually effective or just lucky. Naval historians have debated for decades whether the resources devoted to the airship program could have been better spent on more patrol planes or escort ships. Critics point out that blimps never sank a submarine on their own. The kill tally was blimp 0, U-boats 1 if you count K-74's loss. But this criticism misses the point of what blimps were designed to do. They weren't submarine killers, they were submarine deterrents and convoy protectors. Every U-boat forced to stay submerged by an overhead blimp was a U-boat that couldn't intercept convoys. Every time a submarine abandoned an attack run because airship radar had detected it, a convoy passed safely through. The psychological impact on U-boat crews shouldn't be underestimated. German submariners learned to fear and respect the airships. The slow, steady drone of a blimp's engines became a sound that meant danger. U-boat commanders knew that where there was a blimp, there would soon be destroyers and patrol planes. The mere possibility of airship coverage made U-boats operate more cautiously throughout the Western Atlantic. There's also the matter of search and rescue. Blimps saved hundreds of lives by locating survivors of torpedoed ships and directing rescue vessels to them. The airships could hover low over survivors, drop life rafts and supplies, and maintain position to guide rescuers through rough seas or poor visibility. Many merchant seamen owed their lives to a blimp crew that found them clinging to wreckage in the vast Atlantic. The crews who flew these missions rarely received recognition. While fighter pilots and bomber crews made headlines, blimp pilots flew their long, tedious patrols in relative obscurity. A typical mission might last 20 hours, the crew taking turns sleeping in cramped bunks while their crewmates maintained watch over empty ocean. Hours would pass without seeing anything more interesting than waves and seabirds. The work was exhausting, tedious, and occasionally terrifying when Atlantic storms tossed the airships like toys. But the men kept flying. ZP-21, operating from Florida, flew every single day from its commissioning on November 1st, 1942, until the statistics ended on May 15th, 1945. That's 926 consecutive days of operations, an incredible feat of reliability and endurance. Squadron records show that crews maintained this pace, while also performing maintenance, training new pilots, and dealing with the inevitable accidents and equipment failures of intensive operations. Goodyear's production of K-ships peaked in 1943 at 11 airships per month, an impressive rate for such complex aircraft. By war's end, 134 K-class blimps had been delivered to the Navy. The final purchase price for a K-ship in 1943 was $325,000, roughly equivalent to $5.6 million today. That sounds expensive until you compare it to other anti-submarine assets. A destroyer escort cost about $6 million in 1943 dollars. A single K-ship cost about 1/20th that amount, could cover more ocean in a single patrol than a ship could, and required far fewer crew members. The cost-effectiveness was hard to argue with. The blimp program employed thousands of people beyond the flight crews, ground crews to handle the airships during launch and recovery, riggers to maintain and repair envelopes, mechanics for the engines, helium handlers, ordnance specialists, radio technicians. The bases required cooks, clerks, security personnel and medical staff. Naval Air Station Weeksville in North Carolina, one of the largest blimp bases, had over 1,500 personnel assigned at its peak. Women played significant roles in the blimp program, though they weren't allowed to fly combat missions. Female workers assembled envelope fabric, packed parachutes, served as radio operators, and filled countless support roles. At Goodyear's Akron facility, women made up a significant portion of the workforce building airships. The tradition stretched back to World War I, when women had sewn envelope fabric for the Navy's first blimps. After the war ended in August 1945, the Navy faced the question of what to do with its fleet of over 100 blimps. Unlike combat aircraft that could be quickly demobilized, Blimps and their infrastructure represented a significant investment. The massive hangars couldn't be easily repurposed. The trained crews had skills that didn't transfer well to other naval aviation fields, and there remained at least some argument that airships could be useful for peacetime roles like coastal patrol, search and rescue, and mine hunting. The Navy decided to keep a scaled-back airship program. Most of the bases were closed, but stations at Lakehurst, Moffett Field, Weeksville, and a few others remained active. The oldest blimps were retired, but newer K-ships continued flying. Goodyear developed improved versions, the M-Class, and later the massive N-Class airships that could stay aloft for over 200 hours and fly across the Atlantic and back without refueling. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, Navy blimps transitioned to Cold War missions. They patrolled for Soviet submarines. They tested weapons, including experiments with nuclear depth charges at the Nevada test site in 1957. Several K-ships were deliberately destroyed in atomic blasts to test how airships would fare after delivering nuclear weapons against submarines. They served as radar pickets, extending the early warning network against Soviet bombers. The huge ZPG-3W blimps carried enormous radar systems inside their envelopes, serving as flying early warning stations. But even as they proved their continued utility, the writing was on the wall. Jets and helicopters could do much of what blimps could do, with greater speed and flexibility. Long-range patrol planes like the P-3 Orion could cover vast ocean areas quickly. Increasingly sophisticated sonar and radar made submarine detection less dependent on the low and slow observation that blimps excelled at. The economics had shifted too. During World War II, when shipyards and aircraft factories were running flat out, blimps represented an efficient use of limited resources. In peacetime, with the urgency gone, the specialized infrastructure and trained crews were harder to justify. K-43, the last operational K-class blimp, was retired from service in March 1959. The final Navy airship of any type, a ZPG-3W, made its last flight on August 31, 1962. When it landed at Lakehurst, the base log noted simply, "This flight terminates operation of non-rigid airships at Lakehurst." After more than 40 years, the Navy's lighter-than-air program was finished. Today, only a handful of artifacts remain from the blimp program. The control car of K-28, renamed Puritan after the war, is preserved at the New England Air Museum in Connecticut after more than 14,000 hours of restoration work. K-47's control car sits at the National Naval Aviation Museum in Pensacola, Florida. A few of the enormous hangars still stand, including the one at Tillamook, Oregon, now housing an aviation museum, and one at Weeksville, North Carolina, still used by a civilian airship company. Most of the blimps themselves were scrapped, their aluminum control cars melted down, their fabric envelopes cut up. Only a few photographs and fading memories remain of the silver whales that once patrolled America's coasts. The veterans who flew them are nearly all gone now, the last of them passing away in recent years. But their contribution to victory in the Atlantic shouldn't be forgotten. In the desperate years of 1942 and 1943, when U-boats threatened to sever the lifeline between America and Britain, blimps provided protection that more glamorous weapons could not. They couldn't sink submarines alone, but they didn't need to. They kept convoys safe, they found survivors, they denied vast stretches of ocean to enemy submarines simply by their presence. At the height of the Battle of the Atlantic, merchant seamen on slow, vulnerable cargo ships would scan the sky anxiously for threats. But when they spotted the reassuring bulk of a Navy blimp taking station overhead, they knew they had a guardian watching over them. For 20, 30, sometimes 40 hours, that blimp would pace their convoy, never more than a few miles away, ready to call down destruction on any submarine foolish enough to attack. These slow-moving, ungainly-looking airships were far more formidable than they appeared. Not one ship was lost under their watch, those veterans would say with pride for the rest of their lives. And while historians might quibble about the exact contribution of blimps versus the overall convoy system, the basic fact remains indisputable. The US Navy deployed blimps to hunt U-boats, and the ships those blimps protected made it through. In the brutal mathematics of the Atlantic War, where every ton of cargo delivered to Britain brought victory closer, that was all that mattered. The blimps did their job, and they did it well. The Pacific Theatre would provide an entirely different proving ground for Navy blimps, one that would challenge every assumption about how airships could be employed in combat. While the Atlantic War was fought over relatively compact shipping lanes with established bases, never more than a few hundred miles from patrol areas, the Pacific stretched across millions of square miles of open ocean. Distances that seemed vast in the Atlantic were routine in the Pacific. A patrol from Hawaii to Midway covered over 200 miles each way. The weather could shift from calm to typhoon conditions in hours. And unlike the Atlantic, where the primary threat was submarines, Pacific blimps faced the possibility of attack by Japanese fighters. The 1st Navy blimp squadron assigned to the Pacific, ZP-32, was commissioned at Naval Air Station Moffett Field in California on June 1, 1942. They received 6 L-class blimps, smaller and less capable than the K-ships being deployed in the Atlantic. These airships were essentially converted advertising blimps, pressed into military service out of desperation. The L-ships held only 123,000 cubic feet of helium, less than a third of a K-ship's capacity, and carried minimal equipment. But they were what was available, so they went to war. The West Coast in early 1942 lived in genuine fear of Japanese attack. The December 7th raid on Pearl Harbor had been followed by submarine attacks along the California coast. On February 23, 1942, submarine I-17 surfaced off Santa Barbara and shelled the Elwood oil field with its deck gun, causing minor damage but massive panic. On June 21st, submarine I-25 shelled Fort Stevens in Oregon, the first attack on a continental US military installation since 1814. Japanese submarines laid mines off the Columbia River, sinking 2 merchant ships. The threat was real, and the public was terrified. ZP-32's L-ships began flying patrols immediately, searching for submarines and providing some measure of reassurance to a nervous population. But the limitations of the L-class became apparent quickly. They lacked radar, forcing crews to rely entirely on visual observation. Their short range meant patrols were limited to waters within 100 miles of the coast. They carried no depth charges, only small bombs that would be useless against a submarine, and their slow speed made them vulnerable to any Japanese fighter that might appear. Despite these limitations, the West Coast blimps flew constantly through the summer and fall of 1942. They spotted Japanese submarines on several occasions, but could do little except report the contacts and hope patrol planes or ships could respond in time. The frustration was palpable. Crews could see the enemy but lacked the weapons to engage. It was like being a watchdog without teeth. Relief came in late 1942 when K-ships began arriving on the West Coast. ZP-31 was commissioned at Moffett Field with 6 K-class airships in November 1942, finally giving the Pacific blimps real combat capability. These airships had radar, MAD gear, depth charges, and the range to patrol far offshore. More squadrons followed. ZP-33 stood up at Tillamook, Oregon. ZP-51 was established at Santa Ana, California. By mid-1943, over 30 K-ships were operating along the West Coast, from the Canadian border down to the Mexican frontier. The Japanese submarine threat, while real, never reached the intensity of the German U-boat campaign in the Atlantic. Japanese submarines were designed primarily for fleet operations, engaging enemy warships rather than hunting merchant shipping. They were larger, faster, and more heavily armed than German U-boats, but they were also less focused on commerce raiding. Still, they posed enough of a threat that constant vigilance was required. One of the more remarkable episodes in Pacific blimp operations occurred on the night of August 16, 1942, and it remains one of the enduring mysteries of World War II. L-8, a small L-class blimp with a crew of 2, Lieutenant Ernest Cody and Ensign Charles Adams lifted off from Treasure Island Naval Air Station in San Francisco Bay at 6:03 a.m. for a routine anti-submarine patrol. The weather was typical for summer in the Bay Area: morning fog that would burn off by midday, light winds, excellent visibility once the fog cleared. At 7:38 a.m., L-8 radioed that they had spotted an oil slick and were investigating. This was standard procedure. Oil slicks could indicate a damaged submarine, or could be deliberate releases by submarines attempting to fake their destruction. The crew dropped one of their small bombs, more as a marker than a weapon, and circled the area. At 7:50 a.m., they reported they would investigate further, and requested that a patrol boat be sent to the location. Then the radio went silent. What happened next has never been fully explained. At 10:49 a.m., more than 3 hours after their last transmission, L8 drifted over the beach at Fort Funston, just south of San Francisco. The airship was flying erratically, rising and falling as if no one was at the controls. It scraped across the cliff tops, bounced off the ground, and drifted back out over the ocean. Then it turned and came back toward shore. This time it dragged across Daly City, damaging houses and power lines, before finally settling in the middle of a residential street. Civilians and soldiers rushed to the crashed airship. They tore open the control car, expecting to find injured crew members. The car was empty. Both pilots were gone. The engines were running normally. The radio worked fine. The depth charges were still aboard, and there was no evidence of combat damage. The logbook showed nothing unusual. It was as if both men had simply vanished. The Navy launched an immediate and intensive investigation. Search planes scoured the patrol area, looking for bodies or wreckage in the water. Ships searched the oil slick location. Divers went down. Nothing was found. No bodies, no life rafts, no debris. Lieutenant Cody and Ensign Adams had disappeared without a trace. The official investigation concluded that the crew must have fallen or jumped from the airship for unknown reasons and drowned. But this explanation satisfied no one. Why would both men leave the airship? Why was there no distress call? Why were the engines still running and the controls set for level flight? The depth charges had safety pins in place, suggesting the crew wasn't preparing to attack anything. The radio worked, so they could have called for help if they were in trouble. Theories proliferated. Some suggested the crew had been investigating the oil slick at low altitude when a surfaced Japanese submarine opened fire, killing them or knocking them overboard. But there was no bullet damage to the airship, and the control car would have shown signs of combat. Others proposed that one crew member fell out accidentally, and the other jumped trying to save him. But this required believing two trained officers would both abandon their aircraft without even trying to radio for help. More exotic theories involved everything from suicide pacts to alien abduction. The truth is, no one knows what happened to the crew of L8. The incident was classified at the time to avoid causing panic, and by the time details became public decades later, any hope of solving the mystery was long gone. The case remains one of the great unsolved mysteries of World War II, right up there with the fate of Amelia Earhart. What is known is that L8 was repaired, returned to service, and flew for several more years. The airship eventually was retired and scrapped, but its control car was preserved and is now displayed at the Naval Air Station Moffett Field Museum, still bearing the scars from its crash landing in Daly City. By 1943, with better defences in place and the Japanese submarine threat diminishing, Pacific Blimps shifted focus to new missions. They began flying training exercises with surface ships, helping destroyer crews practice anti-submarine tactics. They conducted search and rescue patrols, looking for downed aviators and survivors of sunken ships. They tested new equipment and weapons, and they prepared for what everyone knew was coming, the push across the Pacific toward Japan. In 1944, Navy blimps deployed forward for the first time, moving beyond the safety of the continental United States to advance bases closer to combat zones. This was a huge logistical challenge. Blimps couldn't be easily transported like conventional aircraft. They had to fly to their destinations, which meant crossing thousands of miles of open ocean with no place to land if something went wrong. And once they arrived, they needed those massive hangars and ground crews to operate. The Navy's solution was to establish blimp bases on islands across the Pacific. The first was at Naval Air Station Hitchcock, Texas, which served as jumping-off point for operations in the Gulf of Mexico and Caribbean. Then came NAS Houma, Louisiana. Both stations supported operations against the minimal U-boat presence in the Gulf, but more importantly, they served as training grounds for the longer Pacific deployments ahead. In September 1944, Airship Patrol Squadron ZP-51 deployed to Naval Air Station Pasco in Washington State, then to a newly constructed base at Dutch Harbor, Alaska. This was some of the most challenging flying conditions imaginable. Arctic weather, where temperatures could drop to -30 degrees Fahrenheit, winds that could rip an airship apart, ice that could form on the envelope adding tons of weight, visibility that could go from clear to zero in minutes. The crews flew anyway, patrolling for Japanese submarines in the Aleutian Islands and providing convoy escort for ships supplying the remote bases. An even more ambitious deployment came in 1945 when ZP-51 moved forward to Naval Air Station at Sugi in Japan after the surrender. This required flying K-ships across the Pacific, island hopping through Hawaii, Wake, and Guam. The flights took weeks, with airships stopping at each island to refuel and conduct maintenance. It was the longest deployment of non-rigid airships in history. But perhaps the most important Pacific contribution of Navy blimps came not from combat operations, but from a mission that saved countless lives without firing a shot. In July 1945, with the war against Japan entering its final months, the Navy faced a critical problem. The planned invasion of the Japanese home islands, Operation Downfall, would require minesweeping on a scale never before attempted. Japanese forces had sown thousands of mines in the approaches to their harbours and beaches. These mines would have to be cleared before invasion fleets could approach. Traditional minesweeping used ships dragging sweep gear through the water, a slow and dangerous process. The sweeper ships were vulnerable to the very mines they were trying to destroy, and the task was enormous. Intelligence estimates suggested the Japanese had laid over 25,000 mines in home waters. Sweeping them all could take months and cost hundreds of ships and thousands of lives. Navy planners realized that blimps offered a solution. Their slow speed, excellent visibility, and ability to hover made them perfect for mine spotting. A K-ship flying at 200 feet could see mines floating just below the surface in shallow water, something nearly impossible for surface ships to detect. The airship could mark the mine's location with smoke floats or radio coordinates to minesweepers, allowing the mines to be destroyed without putting ships at risk. ZP-51's K-ships began training for mine-spotting operations in early 1945. Crews practiced flying low search patterns, identifying different mine types from the air, and coordinating with minesweeper ships. The planned deployment would see blimps working with the mine warfare forces clearing approaches to Tokyo Bay, Nagasaki, and other invasion beaches. It would be the largest deployment of Navy airships in the Pacific War, with potentially dozens of K-ships operating from bases in Okinawa and other newly captured islands. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945 and Japan's subsequent surrender made the invasion unnecessary. But the mine threat remained. Japanese mines didn't know the war was over. They continued floating in shipping lanes, waiting to explode against any ship unlucky enough to hit them. The minesweeping mission went forward, now focused on clearing sea lanes for occupation forces rather than invasion fleets. Navy blimps arrived in Japanese waters in September 1945, just weeks after the surrender. They found a surreal environment. American ships moved freely through harbours that had been enemy territory days before. Japanese civilians watched in amazement as the giant silver airships drifted overhead. Some thought they were seeing things that had no business existing, bags of gas with gondolas hanging underneath, hovering motionless like UFOs. For the Japanese, who had no equivalent airships, the blimps were objects of wonder and fear. The mine-spotting work was tedious and dangerous. Mines were hard to see even from a low-flying airship. The water in Japanese harbours was often murky. Waves and reflections created false contacts, and there was always the risk that a mine could detonate if something disturbed it while the airship was overhead. But the blimp crews flew their patterns day after day, marking mines for disposal and gradually clearing the harbours. In October 1945, K-123 from ZP-51 was flying a mine-spotting mission in Sagami Bay when the crew spotted something that wasn't a mine. Floating in the water was a Japanese midget submarine, one of the Type A boats that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack. The submarine was abandoned and partially flooded but intact. The blimp crew marked the location, and the submarine was later recovered and sent to the United States for study. It's now on display at the National Museum of the Pacific War in Texas, recovered thanks to a blimp crew doing minesweeping work. By early 1946, with most mines cleared and occupation duties settling into routine, the Pacific blimp squadrons began returning home. The forward bases were closed. The airships flew back across the Pacific, retracing their outbound routes. ZP-51 returned to Moffett Field in March 1946, ending the Navy's forward deployment of blimps to the Pacific Theatre. The post-war years saw the Navy struggling to define a role for its large blimp fleet. With the U-boat threat gone and Japan defeated, what were airships good for? Some argued they should be retired entirely. that helicopters and long-range patrol planes could do everything blimps did, only better. But others pointed out capabilities that remained unique to airships. Blimps could still hover for hours, something helicopters couldn't do. They were quieter than any fixed-wing aircraft, useful for submarine detection. They could carry heavy loads for long periods, valuable for early warning radar systems. And they were dramatically cheaper to operate than keeping destroyers on constant patrol. The Navy decided to keep a scaled-back airship program focused on anti-submarine warfare and experimentation. Through the late 1940s and 1950s, Navy blimps transitioned to Cold War missions. With the Soviet Union emerging as the new enemy and their submarine fleet growing rapidly, airships found renewed purpose. ZP-1 and ZP-2, operating from Lakehurst and Weeksville, flew constant patrols along the East Coast, searching for Soviet submarines attempting to spy on American naval bases. On the West Coast, ZP-31 at Moffett Field patrolled for Soviet boats operating out of Vladivostok. The blimps were equipped with increasingly sophisticated equipment. New radar systems could detect surfaced submarines at greater ranges. Improved EMAD gear could sense submarines deeper underwater. Sonobuoy systems dropped from the airships could listen for submarine propeller sounds. Infrared sensors could detect the heat of a submarine's diesel engines. The K-ships that had started the war with little more than binoculars, and a radio now carried electronics that would have seemed like science fiction in 1942. In 1951, the Navy introduced the ZP-2N, a revolutionary new airship design. These blimps were enormous, holding 875,000 cubic feet of helium, more than double a K-ship's capacity. They could stay aloft for over 200 hours without refueling and carried a crew of 14 in relative comfort. The control car was divided into separate spaces for flight control, navigation, electronic warfare, and crew rest. There was a galley that could actually cook hot meals, bunks for the entire crew, and even a chemical toilet that worked better than the primitive facilities on K-ships. The ZP-2N could cross the Atlantic non-stop, something no non-rigid airship had ever done before. In 1957, 2 of these airships flew from Massachusetts to Portugal, a distance of over 2,200 miles in 32 hours. They returned via the Azores, proving that blimps could deploy anywhere in the world without needing specialized transport ships. This opened up possibilities for rapid deployment to crisis zones anywhere American interests were threatened. But the most ambitious blimp program of the Cold War was the ZPG-3W, a flying radar station so large and capable that it still seems impossible today. These airships, commissioned in 1958, held 1.5 million cubic feet of helium, making them the largest non-rigid airships ever built. They measured 403 feet long and 85 feet in diameter, truly massive even by today's standards. Inside the envelope was something no other blimp had ever carried, a complete early warning radar system. The ZPG-3W carried an AN/APS-70 radar, the same system used by Navy early warning aircraft, mounted inside a pressurized compartment within the helium envelope. This required extraordinary engineering. The radar and its operators had to work inside the gas bag, breathing compressed air while surrounded by helium. The system could detect aircraft and missiles at ranges over 200 miles, providing early warning of Soviet bomber attacks. 4 ZPG-3Ws were built, serving with ZW-1 and ZW-2 squadrons as part of the airborne early warning barrier system. These airships would patrol off the East Coast, acting as radar pickets to extend America's warning time against Soviet bomber attacks coming over the Atlantic. They could stay on station for days at a time, providing continuous radar coverage that ground stations couldn't match, due to the Earth's curvature limiting their range. The blimps effectively extended radar coverage hundreds of miles out to sea. The ZPGR-3W program demonstrated that airships could still perform missions no other aircraft could manage, but it also revealed the fundamental problem facing Navy blimps in the jet age. The specialized infrastructure and trained crews required to support airship operations were becoming harder to justify as other technologies improved. Helicopters were getting better and gaining longer range. P-3 Orion patrol planes could cover vast areas quickly and carried more weapons than any blimp. Radar technology was advancing to the point where ground stations and shipboard systems could provide the coverage that airborne platforms had been needed for. The economics were shifting too. A ZPG-3W cost about $9 million to build in 1958, equivalent to over $90 million today. That brought an impressive capability, but for the same money, the Navy could buy multiple P-3 patrol planes or S-2 tracker anti-submarine aircraft, each of which could cover more ocean more quickly. The blimp had advantages in endurance and hovering capability, but for most missions, speed and flexibility mattered more. Accidents didn't help the program's cause. In July 1960, ZPG-3W Airship No. 3 broke up in a thunderstorm over the Atlantic off New Jersey, killing all 18 crew members aboard. It was the worst airship disaster in Navy history, and it raised uncomfortable questions about whether blimps were really safe enough to justify continued operations. The investigation revealed that the airship had flown into severe turbulence that overstressed the envelope structure, something that could, theoretically, happen to any airship, but that highlighted the vulnerability of gas-filled envelopes to violent weather. In 1961, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara ordered a comprehensive review of all military aviation programs, looking for capabilities that could be reduced or eliminated to save money. The Navy airship program was an obvious target. It required specialized infrastructure that cost millions annually to maintain. It used significant amounts of helium, a strategic resource needed for other programs. It employed thousands of personnel with skills that didn't transfer to other naval aviation fields. And its mission could be performed, perhaps not as well but adequately, by other platforms that were less specialized and expensive. The review concluded that Navy airships, while still capable of performing their assigned missions, were no longer cost-effective compared to alternatives. On August 31, 1962, the last Navy airship ZPG-3W No. 1 made its final flight. The pilot was Commander Robert Wilson, who had been flying blimps since 1943. He brought the airship into Lakehurst one last time, and when the ground crew secured it to the mooring mast, an era ended. After 47 years, the United States Navy was no longer operating lighter-than aircraft. The immediate aftermath was almost eerie. The massive hangars at Lakehurst, Weeksville, Tillamook, Moffett Field, and other stations suddenly stood empty. Buildings that had housed hundreds of personnel were closed and mothballed. Thousands of sailors and officers trained in airship operations transferred to other specialties or left the service. The institutional knowledge accumulated over decades of operations began to dissipate as veterans retired, and no new airship crews were trained. Most of the airships were scrapped. Their envelopes were cut up, the fabric sold or discarded. Control cars were stripped of useful equipment and melted down for aluminum. Engines went to salvage yards. Only a handful of artifacts were preserved in museums, and even those sat neglected for years as public interest in airships faded. The enormous hangars, too large and specialized to be easily repurposed, stood as monuments to a vanished program. Several were demolished. Others were converted to other uses or simply left to decay. For the veterans who had flown the blimps, the program's end was bitter. They knew airships had capabilities no other aircraft possessed. They had spent years mastering the unique skills required to operate them. They had proved their worth in combat and peacetime operations, and now it was all being thrown away based on cost-benefit analysis and the need to fund newer, sexier programs. Many of the veterans stayed in touch through reunion organizations, gathering annually to share stories and keep the memory alive. They watched as the Navy struggled with anti-submarine warfare problems that blimps could have solved. They noted ironically when the Navy spent billions developing systems to do what blimps had done for millions. But the decision was made, and it was final. In the decades since, there have been periodic proposals to bring back military airships. Better materials, more efficient engines, improved electronics, and new mission requirements have repeatedly led designers to look at airship concepts. The Army experimented with surveillance blimps in Iraq and Afghanistan, using small tethered aerostats to provide persistent observation over bases and cities. These proved effective enough that the programs continued for years. The Coast Guard looked at blimps for drug interdiction patrols and search and rescue. The Marines studied using huge cargo airships to deliver equipment to remote locations without needing airports or ports. None of these programs led to operational military airships. The fundamental problem remains what it was in 1962. Airships require specialized infrastructure and training. They're vulnerable to weather and enemy action, and they're slow, which matters more in modern warfare than endurance. The missions airships could perform are now done by a combination of satellites, drones, helicopters, and patrol planes that, while individually less capable in some ways, are more flexible and easier to integrate into overall operations. but the story of the US Navy blimps hunting U-boats in World War II remains one of the most remarkable chapters in naval aviation history. These unlikely weapons, dismissed by many as obsolete relics, even as they entered service, proved essential to winning the Battle of the Atlantic. They couldn't sink submarines, but they kept convoys safe, which was ultimately all that mattered. They couldn't dogfight German fighters, but they could hover over survivors for hours, saving lives no patrol plane could have rescued. They couldn't carry the bomb loads of heavy bombers, but they could stay over a target area for days, providing reconnaissance and surveillance no other aircraft could match. The men who flew them, maintained them, and crewed the ground handling teams deserve more recognition than they've received. While fighter pilots and bomber crews dominated the headlines, blimp crews flew their long, tedious patrols with quiet professionalism. A typical K-ship pilot in 1943 might fly 300 hours in a month, almost all of it over empty ocean, seeing nothing more exciting than waves and clouds, yet knowing that their presence was keeping submarines submerged and convoys safe. That took a different kind of courage than the dramatic air combat of fighters, but it was courage nonetheless. The statistics bear repeating because they are almost unbelievable. Nearly 90,000 ships escorted by blimps, only one lost to enemy action, over 37,000 combat patrols flown, one airship lost to enemy fire. These numbers represent thousands of merchant seamen who made it home because a blimp kept submarines away from their convoy. They represent millions of tons of cargo that reached Britain and fed the war effort. They represent an operational success rate that no other anti-submarine platform could match. Not one ship lost under blimp escort became the proud boast of the airship service, and while historians might debate exactly how much credit the blimps deserve versus the overall convoy system, the fact remains that when blimps were present, ships survived. The last World War II blimp pilot died in 2019, taking with him memories of hovering over the dark Atlantic at 3 a.m, watching for periscope wakes by moonlight. The last ground crew member who handled those massive airships, wrestling them to mooring masts in Atlantic gales, passed away not long after. The generation that knew these aircraft firsthand is gone. Soon, even their children will be gone, and the blimps will exist only in photographs and documents, artifacts of a vanished era. But their contribution to victory shouldn't be forgotten. In America's darkest hour in the Atlantic, when U-boats threatened to starve Britain into submission, when merchant ships were dying by the dozens every week, when conventional defences seemed inadequate to the threat, the Navy turned to an unlikely weapon. Great silver whales filled with helium, drifting slowly across the sky, watching patiently for the enemy below. The Germans laughed at first, when they even bothered to notice. But the convoys got through, the shipping losses declined, and the war was won. The blimps did their job, asking nothing more than to be remembered for their service.